Number 3. This probably isn't my best story, but it's my favorite. Inmate hadn't showered in weeks. She smelled terrible. She was in secure housing, so her bunkie had been making complaints. After a certain amount of time, lack of hygiene is a disciplinary violation. She goes to confinement for a forced shower. I'm fairly new in the department at this time, so of course I get the grunt work. I have to go to her locker, retrieve her property, and inventory it for storage. She refuses to give us the lock combination, so we had to use bolt cutters. Finally get it open and it's filthy. She has a bag of wet, dirty clothes. I double glove up at this point. I take the bag of clothes out and find used maxi pads all over her property. At the time I was in complete shock, but I couldn't show it. There were roaches coming out of her lockers. I pulled more and more stuff out. Just filthy. I finally get to her paperwork. I was sure that the worst was behind me. Nope. The first folder is full of demonic horned figures. Pages and pages of them. Real grisly pictures. Decapitations, torture, and tons of blood. I thought that these figures were just scribbled in for color, but after I looked closely, it was officers' names written hundreds of times within these characters. Each character was an officer. Each dead figure was a staff member who no longer worked there. I've had inmates threaten to kill me, inmates tell me my address, my license plate number, and where I'm from. Still, to this day, that creepy old woman is the creepiest thing I've ever dealt with. Number 2. We had these things at the prison called mini yards. Pretty much fenced enclosures with a basketball hoop and a concrete floor that were attached to the galleries and separated from the main yard. At 8:15, the inmates would lock down, and by 9 o'clock, we had our count for the evening. After that count, no one was allowed to leave their cell until 4 o'clock, when the workers were allowed out into the kitchen. My first time working the night, I was sitting in the control center when the computer started pinging that someone had pushed into the intercom button on the outside of the mini yard. This, of course, freaked me out, seeing as how I had not let anyone out there, and anyone who wanted to get in from the outside would have to climb through 3 rows of razor wire. I brought up the camera feed, hoping maybe a maintenance guy, for some reason, had used the key to get in from the outside. There was nothing out there. I assumed it was a computer glitch and cleared the call. It immediately rung again. Still nothing from the camera feed. The button that was being pushed was used by the inmates to let us in the control center know that they wanted to come inside. There's also a speaker by the button that they can use to talk to them. I selected the intercom and spoke into, asking who was there. No answer. I decided I should call my lieutenant. At the least, this was a serious glitch that needed to be fixed. And at the worst, it was someone who had managed to stay out in the mini yard hours after lockdown and was messing with me. So I called him and reported it, and all he said was, "Yeah, that happens. Just open the intercom and tell him that the mini yard is closed." And then he hung up. So, I opened the intercom to the seemingly empty mini yard and said, "Sorry, the mini yard is closed," in the same way I would tell the actual inmates on my day shift. Lo and behold, it stops ringing in. Number 1. I worked as a deputy sheriff at Twin Towers Correctional Facility in downtown Los Angeles, famous for housing mentally ill inmates that were arrested within the LA County. To say I am jaded to bizarre activities is an understatement. I once forgot that a man had removed his own testicles that day when my wife asked, "How was work?" Many years ago, when I was on training and working a floor that houses the cream of the crop crazies, a guy tried to commit suicide. Semi-normal occurrence, but odd method of the execution. First, he covered himself in his own diarrhea, though he would be harder to grasp and fight with. Then he packed his mouth full of his own poop and started to swallow it to try to clog his throat. Finally, he found a small plastic bag and put it over his head and started to choke himself out. It was working. Eventually, we had to enter his cell to save him. The creepy part is, now, I don't think I have to explain you how severely disturbed this kid was. He was unhinged. 1,000-yard stare, just crazy. After his attempt on his life, he wasn't talking. After we revived him, no CPR, thank God, he was heavily restrained and looking around at everyone with a blank stare and half grin like, I can't really convey how creepy it was, but you get my point. He wouldn't respond to any of our questions, didn't cry, didn't say anything. I finally asked, in a last-ditch effort, where did you get the bag? And I'll never forget the way his head snapped over to stare at me. And with that same shit-eating grin still on his face, he looked at me and he said, why, the devil gave it to me. And that was the only thing he said.